The first explosion hit at 6:47 in the morning, and Petra Hollis was already elbow-deep in a chest wound when the lights went out. Not the dramatic kind of darkness you see in movies, not the slow flicker and fade, just gone. 1 second, the overhead fluorescents of Bay 4 were humming their usual headache-inducing buzz, and the next second there was nothing but the emergency backup strips along the floor, casting everything in that sick amber glow, and somewhere down the east corridor a sound like God clearing his throat. She didn't flinch. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Every administrator who gave a statement, every news crew that camped outside Riverside Regional for the next 3 days, they all focused on what came next. Nobody mentioned that Petra Hollis, the woman they'd spent 4 months calling a liability, a placeholder, a probationary hire they were waiting to cut loose, didn't flinch. She just said quietly to the surgical resident frozen across the table from her, "Keep pressure on that. Don't move your hands." And then she walked toward the sound. 4 months earlier, she had walked into Riverside Regional Medical Center carrying a paper cup of coffee and a transfer packet that Human Resources had managed to lose twice before she arrived. The charge nurse at the ER intake desk, a broad-shouldered man named Quinlan who wore his seniority the way some people wear cologne, heavily and without apology, looked at her badge, looked at her face, and said, "Float pool?" "Permanent hire," Petra said. "Trauma." "Dr. OC cleared my placement last week." Quinlan looked at the badge again, then at the packet she slid across the desk. "Says here you're on probationary status, standard for new hires." "Right." He handed the packet back without opening it. "Locker room's down the hall. You'll shadow Drummond today. Don't touch anything you're not explicitly told to touch." She had not expected a parade. She knew how hospitals worked. The invisible hierarchy that had nothing to do with the org chart and everything to do with who'd been there longest and who'd survived the most bad nights. She'd navigated versions of it before. Different building, same architecture. What she hadn't expected was Drummond. Nurse Drummond was 43 years old, had worked Riverside's ER for 11 years, and had apparently decided sometime around year 7 that the best use of her expertise was making new hires feel like they were operating borrowed equipment in a language they didn't speak. She had a way of explaining things, slowly, with exaggerated patience, that managed to be both condescending and technically accurate, which made it impossible to object to without looking like you were complaining about being taught. "This," Drummond said, holding up a package of chest seals on Petra's first afternoon, "is a chest seal. Have you used one before?" "Yes," Petra said. "Good. So you understand the basic concept. At Riverside, we have a specific protocol for placement. Let me walk you through it." She walked through it. The protocol was sound. Standard, actually. Nothing Petra hadn't done 100 times, though she kept that to herself. When Drummond finished, she looked at Petra the way a teacher looks at a student who's been suspiciously quiet. "Any questions?" "No," Petra said. Drummond's expression shifted slightly. Not hostile, just recalibrating, like she'd been expecting pushback and didn't know what to do without it. The weeks that followed settled into a particular kind of friction. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could point to and call hazing or harassment. Just the steady, low-level pressure of being trusted with less than you were capable of. Petra was kept away from the critical cases. Her assessments were reviewed twice when others were reviewed once. When she moved fast, and she did move fast, muscle memory from years of operating under conditions that didn't allow for hesitation, Quinlan would materialize at her elbow with a quiet word about following Riverside's pace. "You're trying too hard," said a resident named Wolf one afternoon, not unkindly. He was 27 and had the slightly dazed look of a man who had not slept in 31 hours. "They'll warm up eventually. Just don't make them feel like you're showing them up." "I'm not trying to show anyone up," Petra said. Wolf looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know, but you kind of do anyway." She didn't explain herself. She never had. There was a version of this conversation she could have had. The version where she told him where she'd worked before Riverside, what she'd done, how many times she'd made decisions in conditions that would have given the entire Riverside ER staff collective cardiac events. She could have handed over the version of herself that came with documentation and commendations, and a history that would have reordered how every person in that building looked at her. She chose not to. She had left that version of herself behind deliberately, the way you leave a coat in a house you've evacuated. You know it's there, you know what it cost, you don't go back for it. The worst morning before the explosion was a Tuesday in October, when a multi-vehicle accident brought in 6 patients inside of 20 minutes, and the department was suddenly running at capacity with 2 nurses out sick, and a trauma attending stuck in an elevator between floors 3 and 4. Petra assessed her patient, a 60-year-old man with a seatbelt bruise across his chest and breath sounds that were telling her something his blood pressure wasn't yet, and made a call. "I need a chest x-ray now, and I want a sonographer if one's available. I think he's got a pneumothorax developing." The resident working beside her, a second year named Finch, who was technically her superior in the room and very aware of it, looked at the monitor. His sats are 94. He's talking. He was talking, Petra said. He's not talking as much now. Listen to his left side. Finch listened, with the slightly performative attention of someone who was listening to prove they were listening, not because they believed they'd hear anything. Sounds okay to me. It's diminished. I don't think Finch, she said quietly. Not sharp. Just direct. I could be wrong. I am asking for an X-ray and a sonographer. If I'm wrong, it cost us 8 minutes. If you're wrong, it cost him a lung. Finch ordered the X-ray. The sonographer came. The pneumothorax was there, small, early, exactly the kind of thing that announces itself quietly and becomes catastrophic if you wait for it to get louder. After, Quinlan pulled her aside. You went over Finch's head, he said. I advocated for my patient. Finch is the attending in that bay. Finch is a second-year resident, and I was right. Quinlan's jaw tightened. That's not the point. Then I'm not sure what the point is, Petra said, and she meant it genuinely, without heat, which seemed to bother him more than if she'd been angry. She found out later, through Wolf, that Drummond had gone to the nurse manager that afternoon. Not to file a formal complaint, nothing that left a paper trail. Just to mention, conversationally, that the new probationary hire had an attitude problem, that she didn't respect the chain of command, that she made people uncomfortable. Petra heard this and felt something she recognized as old and familiar, the particular exhaustion of being correct in an environment that found correctness threatening. She had felt it before in different buildings, under different conditions. She knew what to do with it, nothing. You filed it away. You kept moving. You did not let it change how you worked, because the work was the point and everything else was weather. She was thinking about none of this when the explosion happened. She was thinking about the chest wound in Bay 4, a 38-year-old woman named Garrett who'd come in from a construction site with rebar through her left side, and the surgical resident who had good hands but a tendency to panic when things moved faster than expected, and whether they were going to need a thoracic surgeon before one was available. Then the lights went out. Then the sound. Petra told the resident to keep pressure, and she walked toward it. The east corridor connected the ER to the hospital's main lobby, and the lobby was where it had happened. She could smell it before she could see it. That specific combination of burning plastic and something sharper underneath, the chemistry of it, the signature that her body recognized before her mind fully caught up. The lobby was chaos. 12, maybe 15 people down. Ceiling tiles collapsed across the reception desk. A support column had cracked, not structurally catastrophic, but bad enough that dust was still sifting down in a white curtain. The automatic doors at the main entrance had blown inward off their tracks, and at the center of it, 2 men. One was down unconscious, bleeding from his head. The other was standing near the far wall by the gift shop, and he was holding something, and he was looking at it, and his expression was the expression of a man reconsidering a decision he had already made most of the way. Petra had seen that expression before. She walked toward him. Later, the investigators would ask her why she walked toward him instead of away, and she would have difficulty explaining it in terms that translated well to an official report. The honest answer was that she had read him in about 3 seconds, the way he was holding what he was holding, the angle of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness, and she had determined that he was not committed. He was frightened. He had done something and was now standing in the aftermath of it, realizing that the aftermath was real and he was standing in it, and that gap between decision and consequence was a window, and windows closed. She walked toward him the same way she had once walked toward a vehicle on a dirt road outside a city, whose name she was not going to think about right now, in the same tone of voice she had used then, even unhurried, as if there were no emergency, as if this were a conversation she had been expecting. Hey, she said, look at me. He looked at her. You're hurt, she said. It was true. His left forearm had a laceration that was bleeding through his sleeve. Let me see that. He didn't move, but he didn't move away either. I'm a nurse, she said. I work here. You came here because something went wrong, and now something else has gone wrong, and I need you to let me look at that arm. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the ER team mobilizing, the distant shout of someone calling for a crash cart, the beginning of the controlled chaos that a mass casualty event produces in a functional emergency department. She kept her eyes on the man in front of her and her voice at the same register, like a frequency she was broadcasting on, and he was the only one who could receive it. His name, she found out later, was Holbrook. 29 years old, no prior record, a history of untreated mental illness, and a recent eviction, a man who had made a terrible decision and then made it real, and then stood in the rubble of it, holding the only piece of it he hadn't yet used. He put it down before she reached him, just set it on the floor almost gently, and sat down next to it with his back against the wall and put his face in his hands. Petra crouched in front of him. She checked his arm. She applied pressure with the flat of her palm and talked to him quietly, while behind her the ER staff poured into the lobby and began the work of triaging what the first explosion had done, and the security team materialized and stood in a perimeter and waited for her to step back before they moved in. She stepped back when she was satisfied that his arm wasn't arterial. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that compress in memory, not because they weren't distinct, but because they demand too much of the brain to store linearly. 12 patients from the lobby, 3 critical. 1 pediatric, a 7-year-old who'd been visiting her grandfather and caught ceiling debris across her back and was going to be fine but didn't know that yet and was terrified. And Petra spent 11 minutes with her before the grandfather, who was ambulatory, who had minor lacerations, who kept trying to stand up and go to her, understood that the best thing he could do was stay visible and talk to her from across the room in a normal voice until Petra could get the imaging done. Just talk to her, Petra said to him. About anything. About what you were going to do today before all this. He talked. He had a gravelly voice, and he talked about a fishing trip they'd been planning, and a particular lake he'd gone to as a kid, and the girl, whose name was not in any of the reports Petra would later read, which was appropriate, because she was 7 and deserved her privacy, stopped shaking enough for Petra to work. Drummond was there through all of it. To her credit, whatever Drummond's failures as a mentor, she was an excellent nurse in a crisis, and she moved through the chaos with the efficiency of someone who had earned her 11 years. At some point, she ended up working beside Petra at the same station, and they functioned without speaking because they didn't need to. The work had its own language, and in it there was no probationary status and no attitude problem and no chain of command dispute. Just hands and time and what needed to happen next. At one point, when a patient had been stabilized and they had a 30-second gap, Drummond looked at Petra. Petra was wrapping a dressing. She didn't look up. "Where did you work before here?" Drummond asked. "A lot of places," Petra said. Drummond didn't ask again. The debrief happened 3 days later, in the hospital's main conference room, with administration and 2 people from the County Emergency Management Office and a liaison from somewhere that wasn't named on any of the paperwork. Petra sat at the end of the table and answered questions and kept her answers to what she'd observed and what she'd done and why. When they asked about Holbrook, about her decision to approach him, about her assessment, about the specific way she'd spoken to him and what she'd said, she answered accurately and without editorializing. The man from the unnamed office looked at her for a moment after she finished. "You've had tactical training," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I've had relevant training," Petra said, which was true. He nodded. He wrote something down. He didn't ask which branch, which unit, which particular theater of operations had given her the specific skill set she deployed in a hospital lobby at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. She appreciated that. Quinlan was at the debrief. He sat 3 seats down from her and did not look at her directly for the first hour, and then he did. And whatever he saw when he looked at her seemed to require some internal rearrangement, because after the meeting ended and the room was clearing out, he stopped beside her chair. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. "You were right about Garrett," he said. "The pneumothorax. I looked at your notes afterward. You called it before the imaging." "I know," she said. He stood there for another moment, and she could see him working through something. The particular discomfort of a person whose operating assumptions have been made suddenly visible as assumptions. It was not a comfortable process, and she wasn't going to make it more comfortable. But she wasn't going to make it harder either. 4 months, he said finally. That's a lot to hold on to for 4 months. "I wasn't holding on to anything," she said, and that was true too. "I was just doing the work." He left. She gathered her folder. Drummond was waiting in the hall. She fell into step beside Petra without ceremony, the way she had at the triage station, just there in the space, moving in the same direction. "There's a staff meeting Thursday," Drummond said. "Grief counselors coming in for the team. Some of the newer staff are having a rough time." "I'll be there," Petra said. "They're also talking about restructuring the float coverage in trauma, more permanent assignments." A pause. "Someone mentioned your name." Petra looked straight ahead. The corridor was long and bright and smelled like every hospital corridor everywhere, antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath that was just the smell of urgency absorbed into the walls over years. "Okay," she said. "That's it? Okay? I'm not sure what else to say." Drummond made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite." The almost law of someone who has been doing something one way for a very long time and is encountering, for the first time in a while, the possibility that there is another way. "You're really not going to make any of this easy, are you?" "I don't think any of this should be easy," Petra said. "I think it should be accurate." Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then fair enough. They walked the rest of the hall without speaking, which was comfortable in a way that 4 months of friction had not managed to be. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet. but the beginning of something that could, given time and honest work, become respect. At the end of the corridor, they split off toward their separate stations. Drummond toward the nursing station, Petra toward Bay 4, where a new patient had just come in, and someone had taped a handwritten sign to the door that said "Ask for Hollis," and she had not put it there and did not know who had. But she read it as she pushed through the door, and she let it be what it was. She put on her gloves. She listened to the patient's history she began.